I have the greatest privilege to welcome Dr. Carolyn Byerly in our midst today. She joins us from Washington, D.C. And she is probably the best person I could think of who can shed some light about media ownership and how we can problematize the relationship between that and media content and how that relates to freedom of speech in general. Okay, so Dr. Byerly's CV doesn't look like this. It runs into about 25 pages. And I'm going to make it more personal here because I know her personally, and she's a friend. And before we started recording, we had a half an hour conversation, just catching up. She's co-founder of the Howard Media Group, apart from, of course, the fact that she's chair and professor at Howard. She's authored 5 books, and probably I know that there's some more in print right now. Literally hundreds of scholarly articles. I tried to count, believe me, I could not. And lots of big book chapters. And she's received so many grants and scholarships for her pioneering work on media and especially on gender. Dr. Byerly is one of the best known gender scholars in the world. She's been chaired of many, many doctoral dissertations and master's theses, including mine. She was my thesis chair at Radford University, and I'm so proud of that because that thesis wouldn't have got where it did if it were not for Dr. Byerly's constant advice, guidance, and also prodding. She's been awarded internationally many, many times. She's been professionally associated with many scholarly standards, mentoring, other kinds of associations. And she also has a PhD from the University of Washington. Now, Dr. Byerly and I are going to be talking today about why media ownership is really needed in our midst at all. Why a non-media person should even understand or be literate about who owns the media. So welcome, Dr. Byerly. I couldn't be more pleased to welcome you to talk about something that you and I have been talking about for decades now. So welcome to this.
It's wonderful to be here, Shashi, and to be able to, in a sense, meet your students and others who'll be watching this. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. So if you're okay, we'll jump right in, and we can start with what I had to ask you. First of all, I think we're all very curious to know why it is important for non-media folks to know about the media in general, but I think specifically maybe about ownership patterns and probably the privileges that are involved in that kind of a organizational structure. I mean, the structures. I just want you to problematize this for us.
Well, the whole field of media literacy was actually developed for the public, not for scholars, not for people in the media. It was really developed for, ordinary people who use the media and watch the media and listen to the media. And so, and the whole push behind or motivation behind developing a whole field of work called media literacy is because we are almost everywhere in the world, both developing and developed countries, we're inundated by the media, all sorts of media every day, to the point where we have almost no consciousness of what is bombarding us, what we're immersed in. And so the first principle, I guess, in media literacy is really to bring awareness of what messages and images are coming at us. And that's where you start, but with media literacy, that's not where you stop. You really have to also understand the forces behind what brings those images and messages to us. And so that means that you have to dig into the layers of what we call media. Media are just, I try to tell people media have no ability to do anything. Media are just dumb instruments, right? Your telephone sits over there. It doesn't, by itself, it can't do anything. Your television, it can't do anything. Your computer is completely powerless. It's all about those who use it, who produce content for it, the larger environment in which media operate. And so these are the layers of media. I call the micro, the meso, and the macro levels of media. It's really important to understand what goes into making what we see and what we hear. And so in many ways, because we are media consumers, the critical issue is how much do we know and understand about our national policy that creates the media and, the policies for the media environment, that the people who own the media, who determine the values and the production codes of the media, the laboring class that works within the media, where do they contribute and what are their limitations? Those who make the news or write the news, for instance. And so therefore, the term media itself is a really complicated, multi-layered concept that doesn't have any specific meaning, but it has multiple meanings. And so I think the whole notion of media literacy means understanding the complexity of what we call media today.
Right. I mean, that actually takes me to the next question, because we know that most of us think of media as singular, and I have grown used to using the word media as singular. So do pardon me. I know you will chide me for it, but others need to understand that media, the word media is actually used in the plural, which you have been, and you've been trying to tell me multiple times as well. I just wouldn't listen. Whether it's public ownership or public control, and by public, really, we're talking about the government, aren't we? I mean, it's not really public, or whether it's private ownership. One of the things that you said really, really struck me as so true is that what are the pressures on people actually working in the media? I mean, it's not like it's just the owners who are just controlling everything and nobody, so everybody's a puppet. That's not true either. But at the same time, what kind of impacts and pressures and influences does ownership actually have on what we see on say our television sets?
Enormous, of course. And let me just unpack those terms, public and private ownership, a little bit, because about 10 years ago, I conducted a 59-nation study on women's employment status within media industries, within the news industry specifically. And we looked at the traditional industries where most people are employed, television, newspapers, and radio. And we had a question on our questionnaire, and India was one of our countries, by the way, where we studied. And so our researchers we had 162 researchers, and they went into media companies and they asked people questions. Well, the issue, we had a question about ownership. Well, it turns out, depending on what country you're in, the whole definition of let's say public, for instance, changes. In authoritarian countries, the notion of public means government ownership and control. So the government might finance the media company, but at the same time, it controls the content of it. Whereas the notion of public in the UK, for instance, so the government finances the parts of the BBC anyway, but allows complete editorial independence. The whole notion of private as well. What does private mean? Does that mean a family owns the media company? In India, that actually is the case, where some families own a whole huge media company. That might actually be true with the Hindu, I'm not sure. But in other places, the notion of private means commercially supported. And so I think when you start talking about those words, you have to understand that, first of all, what you're talking about in a given context, and it's usually a national context, and then how that particular kind of ownership has a rippling effect down really to the people who work within the industries and the people who then consume it. So what are the relationships of people all along the line from the top to the bottom?
Right. So that's
I don't know if that's what you were trying to get at, but
no, that's exactly. I mean, that's great to unpack what actually public and especially what private media ownership would mean. And like you said, okay, so they own it. Is that problematic? Is there a problem in the fact that I'm taking several steps back, as you can see? Is there a problem in the fact that they all control the content that goes into our news media?
I mean, yes. I mean, having independent media means that you will have a more democratic informational landscape. And I think that's at both the entertainment level and also the informational level, what we think of as news or public affairs. And I think that when we consider, and I think you and I both have a strong value system for democracy and the role of media in democracy.
So we do come, both of us, from the two largest democracies in the world. So we are self-professed democracies as systems ourselves, right? So so apart from individual values that we have, we do come from systems that are supposed to uphold those democratic values.
And our two countries are also similar right now on being at the brink of having our democracies greatly threatened. And the media play a role in this. For instance, and going back to the whole notion of media ownership, what we've seen internationally is the conglomeration of media systems, more and more media coming under the control of fewer and fewer people. And so the concentration of ownership means that those who control and own those media, and this happens mostly in the commercialized media, those people can set the value system, the standards. They can decide when they buy a new media system, they can decide whether or not they're going to keep those employees. The laboring class within media, and that is really the whole creative and production class, they have very little control. They have to really follow the dictates of those, who oversee them. And so when you've got concentrated ownership, you've got a value system, and in most cases, a pro-corporate, pro-capitalist value system that really makes it difficult for other voices and other points of view to get in. And so I think in my own country, the United States, we've really seen the cause and effect that this creates. What you have is a citizenry that's not informed and not media literate, and not, and I'll also say in our school systems, we quit teaching what we call civics or government information many, many years ago. So kids don't know how their government works. They don't know how their economic system works. And so the ideas that they get through the media system, through the news particularly, tells them the way the world is. Well, they don't know any alternatives. And so when, the national government does something that's totally undemocratic, they don't have a way to understand it because the media have never told them, and neither has their school system. So you've got these institutional layers that contribute to our understanding of the world that we live in, the society that we live in, not just our rights, but also our responsibilities, right? Our responsibilities to participate. You're not going to get that from the media. You're not going, here in the US, we think that you're participating in democracy if you show up at the voting and vote every 4 years or something. That's not actually how it happens, right? You have to enter into it on a continuous basis. but there's virtually nothing in our media system that would tell us that would help us to understand that. So.
That's very interesting. That's very fascinating to me, because you're saying that the fact that media are owned by people makes those people more privileged just by being owners of the media.
Yes, 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 because those who control these conglomerates, the boards of directors, are very, very rich. I study gender and also race. I teach at a historically Black African-American university. And so we look at both gender and race implications of all sorts of things in relation to culture and media. And so you've got very, very rich and also male. These owners are not women, they're male. And very few of them are women, and they're white. And I say that it's a global phenomenon, because the majority of the world's media are owned by a very small tier of 10 or 12 companies, most of which are headquartered in the United States. And so you've got, when I say that there's, the media system internationally breaks down along the fault lines of race, gender, and class. And they're distinct, and you can define them, and you can do it statistically.
That brings me nicely to the next question is, don't you think, therefore, that as social media users, all of us literally in this social media space, with the exception, obviously, of those who are marginalized, and we continue to marginalize them, but those of us who are we not more empowered now because we are owners of the content that we deliver?
Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that we can pick up our cell phones, or we can go online sitting at your desk computer, and you can literally be the content producer of all sorts of things, and you can create these interpersonal networks that have, that you've seen. I'm sure you've seen some of the diagrams of Twitter, for instance, and it goes to the first layer and then the second layer, and it becomes global. I mean, we've seen this with the movement for Black Lives. It's become a global movement, and the protest events worldwide began here after the killing of George Floyd a couple of weeks ago. But it literally brought racism out, racist resistance to racism out all over the world. And so you saw peaceful protest gatherings all over Europe and in parts of Latin America. I mean, it was just amazing, actually. That happened through social media. Social media enable people to raise issues and to mobilize crowds, to mobilize action on the part of many, many people. However, and this is where I think we have to be critical media scholars and consumers, you can't change institutions through social media. You can change some people's ideas, you can mobilize people's interest, but social movements really have to be structured in a way that they have achievable outcomes, and you have to have leaders who know how to do that, okay? And so just because you can mobilize millions of people into the streets to protest racism, for instance, or labor issues or anything else, doesn't mean those conditions are going to change unless you have movements on the ground to really make the changes always have to be institutional. And what I think has been so interesting, the political left in the US has now begun to really look at, say, look, the movement for Black Lives that mobilized all these people, millions of people into the streets here and globally, that only happened because of all of the work that's been done in anti-racism through specific organizations over the last 15 or 20 years. More recently here, since the killing of Trayvon Martin in, was it 2012? particularly the last decade. So it was because we had we had organizations to stand up against racism, that we were able to mobilize people. And then now I see what is at least happening in the US is leaders are now beginning to meet with members of Congress, meet with state legislatures. You're beginning to see now the institutional change that's going to come from this. So social media played a role in that, but in the end, the institutional change will only happen through more behind the scenes work in legislatures and school systems and so forth.
That's so interesting, because I just wish we could expand more on structures and agency, and how agency necessarily doesn't break structures, but it does galvanize. It also reminds me of another point that, and again, I think you'll chide me for this, but I tend to say that echo chambers have a purpose. And just like Donald Trump might have an echo chamber that responds and resonates with what he says, echo chambers could also galvanize and mobilize movements, don't you think? Do you think?
Yes, I mean, that's a really important point. All use of social media and all social movements are not progressive. They're not inherently democratic. Some can actually be, and we're seeing this play itself out, aren't we, in both India and the US right now. They can also be repressive. They can be fascist. Yeah. They can be exclusionary and based on value systems that spawn hatred and otherness. And so we have to be aware that, yes, I mean, again, it goes back to agency. Who's in charge? When you've got something like social media, you've got, everybody's using them. I mean, look, Facebook finally, the executives there finally decided that they would remove Donald Trump's ads or any content related to Donald Trump that uses Nazi or white supremacist imagery or has content in it that is racist in nature. But it took them several years to come to that policy. You know, why? Well, they were making lots of money from the advertising. You know, what would motivate them? What it took was Facebook users began to close down their sites, you know, their Facebook pages, and threats of widespread boycott and the emergence of alternative social media sites. And so I think, you know, ultimately, we have to be aware that, and you know, this goes to, I don't know if this is the point you want to bring this in, but I think the whole dialectical process is really important to keep in view. You know, Hegel's version of history, that history moves forward through struggle, and struggle happens through opposite ideas that contest each other. And those ideas, those struggles are ongoing all the time. You've got the political right, and you've got the political left, and they are in struggle with each other right now. We've never, in my lifetime, seen this kind of a blatant force. I mean, you know, political contest, the struggle that's going on, the dialectical process, it's not clear what the outcome is going to be. It's not clear. But it is clear that that media, all media will play a role in it in some way.
Well, you know, we can hope that that's a global phenomenon, because I know for sure that much of the media in the United States, for example, are very open about their stand. Here in India, one of the we're talking about layers in ownership, and that stuck with me. That if a Facebook or a Twitter wanted to do the exact same thing that they did in the United States, that attempt would be futile, because there are owners of owners, and the political owners, whatever it could be, whatever denomination they come from, could actually thwart that very, very effectively, right? So even within the democratic systems that we live in, I guess there are different layers of democracy and different degrees of democracy that we're seeing around.
I agree.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we've done so far is to be able to effectively surface what actually is wrong with media ownership, or why media ownership is inherently problematic. And as much as we think that we are in a state of media democracy, because social media are here and we have all the power in the world to actually express ourselves, is that actually true? That's what you've made us kind of think about, and think uh, more deeply about, um, and probably connect the dots with our own everyday experiences with what we have. I mean, we have somebody being arrested here for stating something that's perfectly legal. You have somebody who's actually spreading fake news and probably even getting away with it. So we have all these dynamics, and it's always uh, it's such it's so powerful right now that the United States and India might be on the same plane in terms
Yeah.
of a less and less democratic and a more and more authoritarian system.
Yeah.
And 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 in some ways a lot of people seem to be agreeing with that shift. And you and I have, I think, always held that opposite value of saying that democracy is a good thing. I mean, let's actually further democracy if we can. And yet the world seems to be going a little slow on that part, if that's even a euphemistic way of putting it. So
Yeah, I mean, there is that illusion that you're alluding to here of you have a media landscape that has just lots and lots of different sources of information. And but because of that, nobody can have the attention span to take it all in and digest it and synthesize it. And what we end up doing is selecting what we want to see and hear. And that usually is information that reinforces what we already think, right? The whole thing of selective perception. And it's not, and that means that if you're a white supremacist or somebody who subscribes to sexist ideology, that or you're strongly embedded, with values of capitalism and the free market, you're not going to look for value. You're not going to look for information that's going to challenge any of those values. But I think the thing, going back to media ownership, the thing that is invisible to us, that really has such an important force in what we know about our society, is that when you concentrate the ownership of media companies, what you're also doing is consolidating the economic power of those who own it or have stock in it. And that enables them to control the range of ideas that are going to be pervaded and distributed through there. I mean, our old friend Karl Marx, if I could go back to one of the cliches that are so often quoted by progressive media scholars, and that is those who own the means of production also own the ideas, or determine the ideas that will be disseminated through that means. So that means when you've got a company that owns the majority of the book publishing industry, the social networking sites, television, radio, what have I left out? Internet. When you've got a few companies that have vertically integrated and also horizontally integrated all of those different kinds of companies, then it's their value system that operates, right? It's their, and they decide what kind of people they're going to, when I was teaching journalism, when you and I first met some years back, I would teach students to report critically, to ask critical questions, to how to go in and read, company policies or government policies and ask interview questions that were really critical. And they would go out into the media and get their first jobs. And they would find out that their editors or their program directors didn't want them to ask those kind of questions. And I had one student who actually won a local Pulitzer Prize for reporting on toxic waste or something in a particular community that was near black housing area. And her editors watered it down so much that the name of the company that was contaminating this site was never mentioned. And they watered it down to the point where it really took the critical nature of her report out of the story altogether, but she still won a prize for it. And I had lunch with her and she said, "I'm leaving the news business." I said, "Why? You just won a Pulitzer." She said, "I won a Pulitzer for crap reporting." Right? For reporting that was so innocuous. It never held anybody responsible. You know, and so, I mean, these are the sorts of things. So reporters that have those kinds of critical judgment and really want to go to the heart of social problems, they have a very hard time making their way into, you know, corporate-owned media systems. So I'm an advocate for alternative media myself, but that's not what most people consume.
Things that we need to bear in mind is what ownership is actually doing to the content of what we are seeing, and what we only think about what content we see. We don't think about what content we don't see or what we don't consume. So what's actually not there is we are made to forget that we are not seeing something or not reading something because we are constantly bombarded by what they want us to see.
Yeah. I mean, we have no way even to imagine what we're not getting, what we're not being exposed to, unless we have alternative sources outside the mainstream. I mean, I think people like you and I look for those other points of view, other analyses, other voices. But we have to, I certainly didn't grow up I grew up in a conservative household. I wasn't taught to read, you know, widely. I had to cultivate that just through over the years, and it wasn't anything I sought to do. It was people started questioning me. Wait a minute, haven't you thought about this, that, or the other thing? Well, no, I hadn't, you know. I mean, those were in my 20s that people started saying, you know, "Why, you're supporting the Vietnam War? What's wrong with you? Haven't you thought about this, this, and this?" No, I hadn't, you know. "Oh, well, come to a march with me next Saturday." So those sorts of things, people I knew who were outside my little bubble of happiness began to make me uncomfortable, began to question me, to make me think about things. And of course, once you start questioning, you're like unraveling the sweater, right? You don't really go back. You just keep pulling and pulling and pulling until you get the whole ball of yarn. And I think most of us in our lifetime are still pulling that ball. I mean, we're never going to finish because there's more, because the world keeps changing around us, doesn't it? And so we have to have the critical thinking tools to begin to question, to always question and never take for granted that we've found the whole truth, because it takes your lifetime to keep looking for that truth. And so when we are bombarded by false information or fake news, as they call it, or a particular hegemonic value system that dominates our landscape, it's very hard to challenge that if you're a lone voice. I think finding others who share similar ways of questioning is really important.
Dr. Byerly, it's always a pleasure to talk to you or to exchange ideas with you. But for once, I've been able to share your ideas with students of a much younger age, as well as students who are not necessarily exposed to the media. But as always, it's a great pleasure to talk to you. And just looking at you makes me feel very nostalgic about the kinds of, you know, intellectual struggles we used to have back in Radford 25 years ago. But,
Well,
but it's been a real
the
pleasure.
pleasure, again, it's a pleasure to meet your students and to see you again as always, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Dr. Byerly. Have a good day.
My pleasure.